Section 5. Fascism and War. We start with a quote from Mussolini's The Political and Social Doctrine of Fascism. Quote, "Fascism believes neither in the possibility nor the utility of perpetual peace. War alone brings up to its highest tension all human energy and puts the stamp of nobility upon the peoples who have the courage to meet it." Unquote. Comment, how convenient for capitalism, which happens to require war. And another quote from Hitler's Mein Kampf, quote, "In eternal warfare, mankind has become great. In eternal peace, mankind would be ruined." Unquote. The chauvinistic, warlike character of fascism is its most obvious external characteristic. The war role of fascism can, however, only be correctly understood in relation to its general social role as the expression of the extreme stage of imperialism in breakup. On the question of fascism and war, very much nonsense has been written. On the one hand, bourgeois critics of fascism in Western Europe and America expressed their shocked indignation as if fascist Germany and fascist Italy were the first and only countries to go in for jingoism, wholesale war incitement and war preparation, and as if England, France, and the United States were innocent angels of peace. On the other hand, supporters of fascism in these countries endeavored to accept at face value the transparently hypocritical, quote, peace speeches occasionally turned out by the fascist leaders for foreign consumption, in open and glaring contradiction to their main utterances, and seek to soothe an alarmed public with fanciful reassurances, as if fascism were really a doctrine of world peace. Comment, let me direct your attention in the modern age again to libertarianism, which basically does the same thing, except in insisting on a society based on private property, and in fact with the most naked and brutal enforcement of private property laws. Libertarians can never have the kind of freedom from a police state or from war that they claim to espouse, because that's the purpose of police, and war is also necessary to settle disputes over world markets, etc. So it's another example of transparent hypocrisy from the far right on these topics. The system that they're for, maintaining class society, necessarily involves these things. Continuing, both these lines of treatment, either acting like fascism is the only bourgeois force which is for war, or acting like it's truly anti-war, are an absurd flying in the face of facts. Because fascism is the leading expression of modern imperialism, of capitalism in decay, of the most violent policies of capitalism in crisis, therefore necessarily fascism means war. Fascism, with its violent suppression of all socialist, pacifist, and internationalist agitation, with its militarization of labor and centralized dictatorship, as well as with its ceaseless saber-rattling agitation, is a direct part of capitalist war preparation. Its methods and policies reproduce the conditions of a country at war, as seen in all the belligerent countries in the last war, but already in the pre-war period. In the same way, the final outcome of all the policies of fascism, of all its chauvinist, nationally exclusive, aggressive, and domination-seeking policies, can only be war, as indeed its leaders in all their principal and most authoritative utterances to their own followers openly declare. But these tendencies are not peculiar to fascism. They are common, in greater or less degree, to all imperialist states. They only receive their most extreme expression in fascism. Fascism in Britain, where there is no such immediate, easy basis for war agitation as Versailles provided in Germany and also in Italy, and where mass anti-war feeling is strong, endeavors to hide for the moment the war role of fascism, and even to put on a pacifist dress and present fascism as a doctrine of world peace. Thus Mosley writes, quote, "Fascist organization is the method of world peace among nations bound together by the universal fascism of the 20th century." Unquote. This blatant attempt to throw dust in the eyes of the credulous is exposed by the entire propaganda of fascism. Mosley, who professes to proclaim the aim of, quote, world peace through fascism, will need to fight it out with his masters, Mussolini and Hitler, who denounce in round terms the whole conception of world peace as incompatible with fascism. Quote, "Fascism," proclaims Mussolini, "believes neither in the possibility nor the utility of perpetual peace." Quote, "In eternal peace," proclaims Hitler, "mankind would be ruined." Unquote. Quote, "Fascism issued from war," writes the fascist Carly, "and in war it must find its outlet." Unquote. This is the dominant voice of fascism. The temporary pretense of British fascism to put on a peace advocate's dress is only a typical example of fascist demagogy. International fascism is a contradiction in terms. The foreign policies of fascist states can only be the foreign policies of extreme, aggressive imperialist states, with all the consequent antagonisms heightened to the most extreme point. The identity of counter-revolutionary policy produces no identity of foreign policy. This is strikingly illustrated as soon as the first three fully completed fascist states, Germany, Italy, and Austria, have come into existence, by the extreme tension immediately following, even to the point of veiled war threats, between fascist Germany and fascist Italy over the body of fascist Austria. The conception of a bloc of fascist states on the basis of a common policy of fascism is a myth. An alliance between such states can only be formed where an identity of immediate aims of the foreign policy of the imperialist groupings concerned would have in any case made an alliance possible, whatever the political form. But if the fascist type became generalized for all the leading imperialist powers, this would only mean an immediate accentuation of the antagonisms and hastening of the advance to war. The extreme tensity of war preparations and inculcation of the war spirit in fascist Germany and fascist Italy has been equally noted by observers of all political colors. For the evidence of the developments in Germany, especially, reference may be made to Wickhamsteed's Hitler, Whence and Whither, to the American journalist Leland Stowe's Nazi Germany Means War, and to Ernst Henri's Hitler over Europe. This does not mean that fascist Germany, any more than fascist Italy, aims at immediate war. To this extent, and no further, the peace speeches are sincere, insofar as they are calculated to gain time and cover the necessary process of rearmament. Unless the situation is precipitated by unexpected events, a preliminary period is sought for the necessary heavy war preparations, as well as for the diplomatic preparation of a favorable situation. The present balance of power is unfavorable to Germany, and the position of Italy is also weak, but there is no question of the goal to which policy is being directed. As Hitler's Mein Kampf and Mussolini's speeches make abundantly clear, the full aims of the fascist program of territorial and colonial expansion can only be finally achieved by war. England, France, and the United States, whose statesmen and publicists indulge in expressions of shocked surprise at the militarism of fascist Germany or of Japan, are in fact far more heavily armed than Germany, Italy, or Japan. They spend more on armaments, and they have bigger records of plunder and armed violence all over the world. But the difference in the present situation of these two sets of powers, which partly accounts also for the more rapid development of fascist forms in the latter group, lies in the fact that England and France, the position of the United States, owing to its special continental situation, is in a category by itself and shares characteristics with both groups, are relatively sated imperialist groups. They're gorged with world plunder, and they're seeking above all to hold what they have. Therefore, they're strongly interested in questions of security, while Germany, Italy, and Japan are hungrier imperialist powers, without an equivalent share in the partition of the world proportionate to their strength or potential strength, and therefore they are intent on an aggressive policy of expansion. So comment here, this is kind of like today. You have NATO, which is more sated and more interested in a status quo that preserves their, quote, security, or the security of their dominance. And then you have the emerging imperialist powers of the BRICS nations, which are developing as advanced monopoly capitalists, and they're seeking more of that equivalent share in the partition of the world. And in imperialism, nothing is equal, so everything has to be fought out according to strength in what is basically a might makes right type of situation in the end. Continuing, this is the working of the law of unequal capitalist development, which underlays the last war and drives to the next. What, however, is conspicuous in the present international situation is the relative complacency and even conciliatory attitude with which the other imperialist powers, especially Britain, have treated the question of the rearmament of Germany. In particular, Britain has directly supported and assisted the German rearmament, both materially and financially, and also diplomatically, as shown notably in its line over the German military law of March 1935, and in the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. What underlies this attitude of British imperialism in relation to the open war preparations of German fascism? Apart from the general aims of British policy to counterbalance and weaken the previous French hegemony in Europe, two further dominating factors may be traced. The first is the recognition of fascism as the bulwark against social revolution, and the anxiety not to weaken in any way the position of fascism, and thereby open the way to the fall of the Hitler government and to the proletarian revolution in Germany. Comment, which again, the German imperialists just had a near miss with having their country go socialist, and that is why the fascist government is there in the first place. Continuing, as Lloyd George frankly declared in his speech on September 22, 1933, quote, "If the powers succeeded in overthrowing Nazism in Germany, what would follow? Not a conservative, socialist, or liberal regime, but extreme communism. Surely that could not be their objective. A communist Germany would be infinitely more formidable than a communist Russia. The Germans would know how to run their communism effectively. That was why every communist in the world, from Russia to America, was praying that the Western nations should bully Germany into a communist revolution. He would entreat the government to proceed cautiously." Unquote. The national government needed no such entreaties, but has acted throughout as the broker for fascist Germany. The second factor is the widespread hope of imperialist circles, especially in Britain, to use a rearmed fascist Germany, in unity with Japan, for war on the Soviet Union. The objective of an expansionist war to the east, directed against the Soviet Union, and with the support, if possible, of Britain, France, and Poland, is continuously expressed in all official statements of Nazi foreign policy, notably in Hitler's Mein Kampf, in the writings of Rosenberg, the official chief of the Nazi foreign political department, whose line is fully and openly set out in the book, The Future Path of a German Foreign Policy, and also in the formerly withdrawn Hugenberg Memorandum. Hitler writes in Mein Kampf, quote, "For Germany, the only possibility for the carrying out of a sound territorial policy lay in the winning of new land in Europe itself. When one would have territory and land in Europe, this could in general only happen at the cost of Russia." Unquote. Quoting it again, "We stop the eternal march to the south and west of Europe and turn our eyes toward the land in the east. If we speak of land in Europe today, we can only think in the first instance of Russia and her border states." Unquote. The American publicist Calvin Hoover reports the following as his impression of the prevailing tendencies in the event of a possible agreement between Western Europe and fascist Germany. Quoting from Hoover's Germany Enters the Third Reich, quote, "In such a case, the Western European powers might be glad to allow Germany a free hand in the Slavic East and South for the satisfaction of any further expansionist aims. There is evidence that the idea of the reorganization and restoration of Russia under German tutelage is again very much to the fore." Unquote. British imperialism, above all, encourages up to the present, with moral and material support, both Germany and Japan. And influential circles hope for a combined attack of both powers on the Soviet Union. At the same time, German-Japanese relations are drawn extremely close. It is unnecessary here to discuss the powerful resistance which such an attempt would meet, not only from the Soviet Union, but from the whole international working class, leading to the unloosing of revolutionary struggle and civil war above all in Germany itself. Just this prospect leads the imperialist and fascist forces still to hesitate. The final direction of fascist war still lies in the womb of events. What is already manifest is that the advance of fascism has enormously accelerated the advance to war on every side. Section 6. Fascism and the Women's Question. In no direction does the contrast of the two worlds of fascism, or capitalism in extreme decay, and of socialism, as demonstrated in the Soviet Union, express itself more clearly and sharply than in the status of women. The position of women has often been referred to as one of the surest measures of the level of a civilization. By this measure, the Soviet Union stands out as the first fully developing civilization in history, where for the first time men and women participate with full equality, while fascism is revealed in its most undisguised reactionary character. The subjection of women has always been inseparably bound up with class society, and is one of the indispensable foundations without which private property society could not maintain itself. Capitalism has taken over from the preceding period and adapted to its own purposes the social institutions built on the subjection of women. While revolutionizing and organizing production and trade on a gigantic scale throughout the world, it maintained, preserved, and even intensified in a still more limited and narrow form the primitive and anarchic basis of the small-scale individual household, of the family and its ties, and sought to make of this pre-capitalist institution its most powerful conservative pillar of support. Only on this basis could capitalism, with its complete individualist cash nexus repudiation of all social obligations and ties, nevertheless successfully maintain itself, and through the institution of the family, throw off its own shoulders all social responsibility for the proper conditions of motherhood, of the bringing up of children, of the support of the sick and the aged, as well as the enormous volume of so-called domestic labor, all socially necessary labor indispensable for the maintenance of society, but offering no profit for capitalism to organize, and thrown off as unpaid labor onto the shoulders of the working-class wives and mothers to be performed in the heaviest, dirtiest, most unproductive and wasteful pre-machine conditions alongside highly organized large-scale machine industry in the world outside. The consequent economic and social institutions involving the subjection of women and the forcible compulsion of the majority of the women to economic dependence on marriage as their sole means of livelihood are bound up with the existence of private property society and can only be ended with communist social organization. Nevertheless, capitalism in its progressive phase performed also a progressive role in relation to the position of women by offering for the first time the possibilities and conditions of a new economic form of organization. Capitalism, in its search for ever more and cheaper supplies of labor power, draws increasingly millions of women and young persons into industry. Until today, about 1/3 of the total labor force in modern capitalist states consist of women and girls. Despite the brutal conditions of exploitation, more heavy than for the male workers, an inequality defended in the name of the sacred, quote, family, on the basis of the illusory theory that the average woman worker is supposed to have no, quote, dependence. Yet this means that millions of women have for the first time the beginnings of possibility of an independent economic existence and active citizenship, in place of the compulsion of dependence on a male earner as their sole possibility of livelihood and existence. Marx discerned at an early stage the significance of this process. Quoting from Capital Volume 1, Chapter 15, however terrible and disgusting the dissolution under the capitalist system of the old family ties may appear, nevertheless, modern industry, by assigning as it does an important part in the process of production outside the domestic sphere to women, to young persons, and to children of both sexes, creates a new economical foundation for a higher form of the family and of the relation between the sexes." Unquote. The realization of this possibility of emancipation, for which capitalism has thus laid the preliminary conditions, depends on the advance to a communist society. Since the drawing of women into industry, so long as the old property conditions and burden of the individual household remain unreplaced by social organization, only in fact adds to the burden of women instead of liberating them. Only by the full introduction of women into equal partnership in social production, with the consequent necessary equal education and training, and the destruction of old, wasteful, unorganized domestic economy inseparably connected with the private property system, can the old position of the economic dependence of women be ended, and their equality and freedom be realized, not only in form, but in living reality. This standpoint was expressed by Engels in his well-known declaration in The Origin of the Family, quote, "The emancipation of women and their equality with men are impossible, and remain so as long as women are excluded from social production and restricted to domestic labor. The emancipation of women becomes feasible only then when women are enabled to take part extensively in social production." Unquote. The dependence of the solution of the women's question upon the realization of a communist society was constantly emphasized by Lenin. Quoting from his speech to a Moscow Conference of Working Women, "The full liberation of woman and her real equality with man requires a communist economy, a common social organization of production and consumption, and the participation of woman in general production. Only through this will woman take the same place in society as man." Unquote. The Soviet Union illustrates the advance toward this position, where for the first time in the world's history, the real equality of women is being built up and established among all the peoples in its territory. But capitalism, in the period of the general crisis, begins to reverse the engines and move in the opposite direction. It is no longer hunting for new reserves of labor power to exploit. On the contrary, it can no longer find employment for the existing labor force. Hence the cry begins to be sounded increasingly, always from the beginning voiced by the clerical reactionary forces, but now increasingly taken up by modern capitalism as a whole, to drive women out of industry and thus assist to, quote, "solve unemployment" by increasing the number of dependents to be maintained on each wage. The process can be observed in England in the operation of the Anomalies Act and of the barbarous family means test. This cry is taken up in its sharpest and most undisguised form by fascism, here, as in every sphere, voicing the most reactionary tendencies of capitalism and extreme decay. Back to the home. Back to economic dependence on marriage as the sole career for women. Cut down women's education. Expel women from employment and give the jobs to men. Back to pots and pans. Produce more cannon fodder for war. Back to kitchen slavery. This is the line of fascism on the women's question. Comment. Does it sound like any other political party's line on women? Continuing. Hitler writes, quote, "In the case of female education, the main stress should be laid on bodily training, and after that, on development of character, and last of all, on intellect. But the one absolute aim of female education must be with a view to the future mother." Unquote. That's from Mein Kampf. It may be noted that the new German government regulations for cutting down university education and establishing a rigidly limited student quota for all forms of higher education, and that also dependent on political national reliability, restricts women to 10% of the quota of 15,000, i.e. only 1,500 women for the whole of Germany to be permitted in a given year to proceed to any form of higher education, whether universities, technical colleges, or other institutions. In 1931, there were 19,700 women students in Germany. Taking an average 3-year course as a basis, representing an average pre-fascist annual entry of 6,000 to 7,000 women students, this represents a cut by fascism of women's higher education by 75 to 80%. Footnote here, the drastic cutting down of university education, previously the pride and greatest strength of German civilization, is a typical expression of the general cultural reaction of fascism, equally illustrated in the burning of the books, etc. The Berlin correspondent of the Manchester Guardian reported in the beginning of 1934, quote, "Of the total number of matriculated students in the whole of Germany, only 15,000 are to be allowed to enter universities, technical colleges, or other institutes of higher education in the coming year. Some 23,000 matriculated students will be unable to proceed to higher education in consequence of the new regulations." Unquote. At the same time, the Soviet Union educational authorities were reporting that the total number of university and technical college students in the Soviet Union in 1933 was 415,000, as against 203,000 in 1926-7, and 130,000 under Tsarism. In the face of these facts, even the dullest should be able to see that communism, with its basis in science, is bound to conquer the world, while fascism, with its denial of science, is doomed to decay and death. Back to the main text. Spengler writes in his Years of Decision, quote, "Let German women breed warrior men, and take pleasure in breeding them. Woman is to be neither comrade nor beloved, but only mother." Unquote. The American Observer, Calvin B. Hoover, reports the Nazi attitude to the women's question this way, quote, "The attitude of the National Socialists toward women is an integral part of their belief in the desirability of a return to a system of life and morals characteristic of an agricultural rather than an industrial society. The party is determined that the place of women shall once more be in the home. In a word, the National Socialist conception of women in the scheme of things is that they should bear many strong sons to serve the state in peace and war." Unquote. It is an error to suppose that the reactionary fascist attitude to women is simply a reflection of a religious reactionary outlook and yearnings for a pre-industrial type of civilization. The fact that the policy of minute bonuses, not in cash but in orders on the large shops and repayable, for marriage, on the condition that the woman passes out of industry, and the violent propaganda for more births. Comment, see in 2024 Elon Musk's insistence that population collapse is the real threat to humanity, etc. Continuing, are accompanied at the same time by the policy of wholesale sterilization of the alleged unfit or mentally weak, i.e., of those likely to produce offspring unfit for military service, or of those politically unreliable. This latter practice, being extremely offensive to traditional religious sentiment, is sufficient evidence that the policy as a whole is not simply the policy of religious reactionary romanticism, but the conscious reactionary policy of modern capitalism in its most extreme decay. Modern capitalism, while freely exploiting women in industry at sweated rates so far as it has use for their labor, kicks the remainder out of industry whom it cannot employ, bidding them to become dependent on male wage earners and thus save its total bill for wages or unemployment relief, and at the same time calls on them to perform their service in producing plenty of recruits for the increasing needs of the slaughterhouses of imperialist war. This is the viewpoint of modern capitalism in extreme decay, or fascism, on the role of women. In this key question, the role of women, as in its attitude to culture, or in its use of torture and reintroduction of barbaric beheadings, fascism reveals typically its degraded social, political, and cultural level.